Welcome to the walkthrough of the frequently made mistakes for assignment 2A. First and foremost, and I feel like a bit of a broken record at this point, please make sure to document your code consistently. Every line should be commented. And also, please make sure to format your code consistently. I'll talk more about the formatting as we go through the various examples below. First of all, here's a common problem I've seen people running into left over from earlier assignments that have percolated into this assignment. Make sure that you have your splitter factory method in the unsynchronized array.java file actually return something. It shouldn't just return null. If you're getting really strange problems with your splitter blowing up, that's probably why. So go back and take a look at the splitter factory method in that file. Let's go ahead and take a look at some issues with the synchronized array. That's something that grad students have to implement. First of all, make sure that you use array here as opposed to unsynchronized array as the field type for synchronized array, and also make sure that you use the generic syntax properly. Right now, this example is using unsynchronized array instead of array, and it's not putting in the appropriate syntax for handling generics. Another issue, you don't have to have an explicit field that acts as a lock. Instead, you can simply synchronize on this, which is the so-called intrinsic lock that you'll find in Java. Let's take a look at the crawl elements portion. So you can see crawl elements here, or rather crawl page. This particular implementation lacked a terminal operation, so of course it will never run. If you'd taken the time to run the unit test, you would have noticed that your code would have probably either timed out or simply failed to return the right result. So that would be why. You need to make sure you always put a terminal operation if you want your stream to do something. Here's another common set of problems I saw with crawl page. First of all, make sure you pass the appropriate parameters to get page elements. It should be given parameters. Best way to figure that out is to go look at the synchronized loops crawler, which is what synchronized streams crawler is based upon. So take a look there to see how that works. Next issue, don't use map and map to int the way it's being used here, and don't use map at all. Instead, you should use map to int and have that actually do the appropriate processing for the page crawling algorithm. And if you do this, then you can use sum instead of using reduce. And moreover, if you were to use reduce, which you shouldn't, you should be using sum along with map to int, make sure that you use the version of reduce that takes a parameter, so you don't need to use the or else method on optional, which is also overkill. So if you do this right, there should just be one call to map to int here and one call to sum, and that's much cleaner. And of course, other things here to convert the page elements into a stream and so on. Looking down here, this is another set of problems. This code is splitting off handling of pages and handling of images. You don't need to do that. You should use the get page elements that takes both of those parameters, and then use the techniques we were talking about above to handle that properly. Let's now go take a look at some of the problems with process image. So first of all, you don't need to have a local variable at all. You don't need to have something that's an image count. And that will be very helpful since you just return the results of the stream. So that's one thing. Another thing that's wrong here, and a lot of people made this mistake, and again, if you ran the unit test, you should be getting errors, and you should be coming to office hours and asking, why is my code not working? But what you need to do here is make sure that you just count the images that are downloaded and or transformed correctly. You don't want to count all the images, in particular the ones where apply transform return null. You don't want to count those. So make sure that you properly filter out things that fail. Let's take a look at another set of problems here. These two calls to map and map to int can be replaced with two calls to filter. In fact, you can actually get away with just one call to filter if you have the filter have a compound expression, so that's even cleaner. And then make sure that you replace sum with count, which is going to be much cleaner. And it's the right way to handle things here. You don't need to sum stuff up, you just need to count. And that's why you have to make sure you ignore everything that didn't work. Here's some other problems here. We don't need to use map followed by filtering out things that are null. You can just have a single call to filter if you're clever. And like I said, you only need to have one call to filter in process image if you have a compound expression that you're filtering on. Down here is also way too complicated. Just use count instead of using this map and reduce with the integer sum. Here's another problem, bunch of problems here. You should have a single stream pipeline using the fluent interface pattern. You don't need to have a bunch of incremental variables, local variables that are being used to store intermediate results. That isn't really in keeping with the fluent interface pattern that we've talked quite a bit about. Down here, also, don't be using collect here. That's inefficient. There's no need to use collect. Also, don't use map, but instead use a call to filter. Like I said, you can either use one call or two calls to filter. And this is also an illustration of why you need to format your code properly. Now, I wouldn't write code like this in the first place for the reasons we just talked about. But if you were to write code like this, you should be writing it like that so it doesn't run off the end of the page. So don't be writing things where it's all jammed onto one line. Instead, you want to have things like this where you can say, filter the results, blah, 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 blah. And then you'd say, map the results, blah, 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 blah. So this way you can have comments on each of the lines. And it'll also make it a lot more clear if you do this, why you're probably doing some overkill in this code. Whereas if you jam it all like this, it's harder to read, it doesn't scale, it's not commented, it's not as clear as to why it's incorrect. So this code has a lot of things to be fixed. And then finally, you can see here that this is an example. This probably should have gone earlier. This is the synchronized array constructor that takes an unsynchronized array. And this is way too complicated. You don't need to go ahead and allocate a new unsynchronized array and then add the elements to it. Just go ahead and assign unsynchronized array, which is the parameter passed in, to marray. So marray will simply hold a reference to the unsynchronized array parameter. So a couple key points: make sure that you properly document your code, make sure that you put comments between each of these things, make sure that you make your code look like this. So it should make it easy to read every step along the way. It's always consistent, it's always commented. And when you take a look at my comments and they say things like, make sure you document your code, make sure you use consistent formatting, that's what I'm referring to. Don't have things where the first part of the Fluent interface is on one line and then the next part's in a different place, and so on and so forth. Always line things up to be consistent. Always make sure you document them. And if you do that, if you format it consistently, it becomes much easier to document your code. So that's my feedback on the frequently made mistakes for assignment 2A. Most people had things working fairly well, modulo the mistakes that we talked about here. But make sure that you focus now on how to do it more efficiently, how to do it more fluently, and how to document your code and format it in a way that'll be easier for people to read.